The piercing yellow eyes of the German shepherd gleamed in the moonlight as he stood motionless atop the rocky outcrop. Below him, 6 men with rifles crept through the underbrush, their flashlights cutting weak paths through the Montana darkness. Shadow's ears pricked forward, his muscles tensed beneath thick fur that had grown wild since his days as a judge's companion. Behind him, a dozen wolves waited silently, their breath forming misty clouds in the frigid air. A twig snapped in an instant. Shadow's muzzle lifted to reveal teeth honed by wilderness and hardship. The scar across his muzzle, a reminder of human cruelty, pulled tight as he released a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the mountain itself. The lead hunter froze, his rifle barrel dropping slightly as primal fear took hold. Shadow had once fetched slippers and guarded children. Now he guarded something far more ancient, a territory, a pack, a bloodline. And the men who had beaten him, sold him, and left him for dead were about to learn what becomes of a loyal guardian when betrayed. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. Life at Judge William Cooper's estate on the outskirts of Riverside, Montana, had been everything a dog could want. Shadow, a purebred German shepherd with a coat like midnight and eyes that seemed to understand human speech, had come to them as a puppy, a gift to the judge after his successful prosecution of the county's most notorious poaching ring. The Cooper's sprawling log home, nestled among ponderosa pines with the Bitterroot Mountains rising majestically in the background, was Shadow's kingdom. Judge Cooper was a tall, solemn man with silver-streaked hair and hands that were both gentle with his daughter and firm in his courtroom. He'd spent 30 years on the bench, gaining a reputation for his unwavering commitment to environmental protection laws, something rare in a state where hunting and land use rights often trumped conservation. The judge's chambers featured photographs of Montana's wilderness alongside his legal credentials, and he often told visitors that preserving the land was preserving justice itself. Shadow's closest companion, however, was Ayanna Cooper, the judge's 25-year-old daughter who had inherited her Blackfeet mother's high cheekbones and intuitive connection to the natural world. Ayanna had recently completed her doctorate in wildlife biology, specializing in apex predators, particularly the wolf packs that had been reintroduced to Montana decades earlier. She would often take Shadow on long hikes through the wilderness, teaching him commands in both English and her mother's native tongue. "You're more wolf than dog sometimes," she would laugh as Shadow ranged ahead, nose to the ground, moving with the quiet efficiency of a predator rather than the clumsy enthusiasm of a domestic pet. Few knew that the judge had a brother. Redford Cooper had left Riverside 20 years earlier after a bitter land dispute with William. Where the judge saw land to be protected, Redford saw dollars to be made. Their final argument, over a parcel of land bordering Blackfeet territory, had ended with threats and a restraining order. Redford had disappeared into the vastness of Wyoming, his name becoming taboo in the Cooper household. The Blackfeet elders who occasionally visited the Cooper home would eye Shadow with particular interest, especially Takoda, whose weathered face and quiet wisdom commanded respect from everyone, including the judge. "That dog," he once said, stroking Shadow's head, "has the spirit of our ancestors in him. He walks between worlds, that one. Remember this." The case should have been routine, another dispute over hunting licenses and property boundaries, but something about it had put Judge Cooper on edge. The defendants, a hunting outfitter called North Star Expeditions, had been charged with leading illegal trophy hunts onto protected land, but their ownership trail led through a maze of shell companies and hidden investors. When the judge issued an emergency injunction halting all North Star operations pending the outcome of the trial, his clerk warned him that powerful people would be unhappy. "Justice doesn't concern itself with happiness, Ms. Reynolds," the judge had replied, straightening his robes before entering his chambers. That evening he'd lingered longer than usual in his study, reviewing case documents while Shadow dozed at his feet. Shadow's keen ears caught the sound first. A vehicle approaching slowly, lights off, tires crunching softly on the gravel driveway. Judge Cooper was upstairs preparing for bed, and Ayanna was away at a conference in Missoula. The German Shepherd rose to his full height, hackles raised as he moved to the window. Through the glass he saw two men in dark clothing approaching the side door. His deep bark echoed through the house, and upstairs the judge's footsteps quickened. One of the men tossed something through the kitchen window. The crash of breaking glass was immediately followed by billowing smoke that sent Shadow into a coughing fit. He heard the judge shouting his name from the stairway, but the smoke was too thick to see through now. Sharp chemical smells overwhelmed his sensitive nose as he tried to find his master. A powerful arm grabbed Shadow from behind, looping something around his muzzle. He struggled wildly, teeth snapping against the restraint, but a heavy blanket was thrown over him. Through the fabric he heard an unfamiliar voice. "Got the dog, move." "What about Cooper?" came another voice. "This'll hurt him more. Besides, he'll be too busy coughing to follow us. Move your ass." Shadow fought desperately as he was carried from the house, his kicks and twists meeting only tightening grips and a sudden sharp pain in his side that made the world grow distant and hazy. The last thing he remembered was being thrown into a metal cage, the slam of a vehicle door, and the sound of the judge's distant shouts growing fainter as they drove away. He woke to darkness and the rumble of an engine. The cage barely allowed him to stand, and the muzzle around his snout had been secured with zip ties. Around him were other cages with other dogs, some whimpering, others silent with fear. A border collie in the next cage caught his eye and lowered her head. "First time?" she seemed to ask with her posture. Shadow had never been caged before. Judge Cooper believed dogs should sleep where they wished, and Shadow had always chosen the rug beside the judge's bed. The van stopped abruptly. Daylight flooded in as the back doors opened, revealing a stocky man with a pock-marked face and a cigarette dangling from his lips. "This the shepherd?" he asked someone Shadow couldn't see. "Good-looking animal. We'll get top dollar for him up north. Them logging camps always need sled dogs, and the purebreeds don't last." Rough hands dragged Shadow's cage forward. A second man peered in, eyes narrowing. "This one's got fight in him. Might be more trouble than he's worth." "That's why God invented these," the first man laughed, producing a cattle prod. When Shadow growled, the man jammed it through the cage bars, sending a jolt of electricity through the dog's side. Shadow yelped in pain and surprise. "See, they all learn." Shadow was transferred to a larger holding pen with concrete floors and chain-link walls. 20 other dogs of various breeds paced or huddled inside, most bearing signs of neglect or abuse. An older retriever with a graying muzzle approached Shadow cautiously. "New arrival," the retriever's body language seemed to say. "The quiet ones survive longer." For 3 days, Shadow refused the watery gruel they pushed through the fence. He spent hours testing the boundaries of his prison, searching for weaknesses while learning the routines of his captors. When they came on the 4th morning, they brought chains and clubs. "This one," said a new voice, pointing at Shadow. "I'll take him and the husky in the corner. 500 for the pair." "The shepherd's worth 800 alone," countered his captor. "Look at him. He hasn't eaten in days. I need dogs that'll work, not starve themselves out of spite." "Fine. 650 for both, and I'll throw in the old retriever. He's not worth feeding any more." Shadow felt the chains tighten around his neck as they dragged him from the pen. His legs, stiff from confinement, nearly buckled beneath him. Through the open door of the building he could see mountains in the distance and smell pine and snow on the air. Then came another smell, unfamiliar yet somehow calling to him. Wolves. Distant but present in these mountains. Before he could process this new information, he was shoved into another crate, smaller than the first. The husky and retriever soon joined him in the truck bed, and they were driving again, away from his home, deeper into the wilderness. The truck bounced along rutted Forest Service roads for hours, each jolt sending pain through Shadow's stiff legs. When they finally stopped, the air was noticeably colder, the scent of pine stronger. Shadow heard the crunch of boots on gravel, then a new voice, deeper, with an accent he'd never heard before. "He's the new dogs, then. Let's have a look." The crate door swung open. Shadow blinked in the harsh sunlight. Before him stood a broad-shouldered man with copper skin and black hair pulled back in a neat braid. Deep lines etched his weathered face, but his eyes were clear and observant. A patch on his jacket read, "U.S. Mail, Montana Northern Route." "I'm Weah," the man said, not to Shadow but to the dog seller. "Let's see what you've brought me." Shadow remained motionless as Weah approached, neither cowering nor showing aggression. The man noticed the untreated wounds on Shadow's flank and the raw skin where the muzzle had cut into his snout. "You been mistreating this one," Weah said, his voice hardening. "That ain't mistreatment. That's just breaking him in. German Shepherd's got too much pride, got to show 'em who's boss." Weah's lips tightened. "I'll take all three. But I'm paying half what we agreed. These dogs need medical attention." "Now, wait just a minute. Have or I report what I've seen to the ranger station down the road." Weah's tone left no room for argument. The transaction completed, Shadow found himself being led to a simple cabin surrounded by outbuildings. Behind one stood a line of dog houses and a large sled currently propped on sawhorses. 6 other dogs watched their approach with varying degrees of interest and hostility. "This is home now," Weah said simply, removing Shadow's muzzle with gentle hands. "You're going to heal up before you join the team." For the first week, Shadow slept in a corner of Weah's cabin, suspicious of the man's kindness. He'd learned not to trust humans after his abduction. The old retriever, who Weah had named Sage, adapted more quickly, grateful for regular meals and soft bedding for his arthritic joints. The husky, called Nicky, remained aloof and watchful. On the 8th day, Weah brought Shadow outside to meet the rest of the team. 6 dogs stood in a loose semicircle, evaluating the newcomer. At their center stood Shyla, a massive gray husky with one blue eye and one brown. The team leader's posture radiated confidence and aggression. "Shyla's been lead dog for 5 years," Weah explained, unaware that Shadow understood far more than the average dog. "He knows these trails better than I do. But he doesn't welcome competition." As if understanding, Shyla stepped forward, his chest puffed out, a low growl rumbling in his throat. Shadow remained still, neither challenging nor submitting. This subtle defiance seemed to infuriate Shyla, who lunged forward only to be restrained by Weah's sharp command. "Enough, save it for the trail." Shadow's first run with the team came 2 weeks later. Weah harnessed him in the middle position, away from Shyla, who led the pack. The mail route covered nearly 40 miles of wilderness trails, connecting isolated cabins and small settlements untouched by modern conveniences. Shadow's muscles, accustomed to leisurely walks with Ayana, screamed in protest as they climbed steep mountain passes. Whenever Shadow faltered, Shyla would glance back with undisguised contempt. The message was clear. Weaklings didn't survive on this team. By the end of that first run, Shadow's paws were bleeding and his lungs burned with each breath of frigid air. That night, as he collapsed exhausted in his doghouse, he heard Shyla addressing the team. "The new one won't last the month," the husky's body language declared. "Too soft, too domesticated." But Shyla had underestimated the German Shepherd. Judge Coper had often remarked that Shadow possessed unusual intelligence and determination. Each day Shadow pushed himself harder, learning to navigate the treacherous terrain, to anticipate changes in the weather, to work in seamless coordination with the other dogs. Weah noticed. After a particularly difficult run through a snowstorm, he knelt beside Shadow, rubbing circulation back into the dog's frozen ears. "You're something special," the mail carrier murmured. "Not just a sled dog. You think like a human, but move like a wolf." By the third month, Shadow had gained muscle and endurance. His coat had grown thicker, and his senses, already sharp, had become attuned to the subtle dangers of the wilderness. He could smell a storm coming hours before the first clouds appeared, could detect the presence of moose or bear long before they crossed the trail. Shiloh's hostility increased with Shadow's growing competence. The lead dog began deliberately setting a pace that was punishing for the newer team members, forcing them to exhaust themselves keeping up. After one such run, Nicky collapsed in her doghouse, too tired to eat her portion of dried fish. Shadow watched as Shiloh sauntered over and began eating from Nicky's bowl. Without hesitation, Shadow picked up his own untouched dinner and placed it before the exhausted husky. The gesture did not go unnoticed by the other dogs, or by Shiloh, who abandoned Nicky's food to confront Shadow directly. The two dogs stood nose to nose, hackles raised. Shadow didn't back down. For the first time since his abduction, he felt something like his old self stirring inside. The protector, the guardian, willing to stand against bullies regardless of the personal cost. Weah's appearance with an armload of firewood interrupted the confrontation. Shiloh retreated, but the challenge had been issued. The team's dynamics had shifted irrevocably. A week later, they faced the season's worst blizzard on the return leg of their route. Visibility dropped to near zero as they crossed a frozen lake. Shylock, pushing the pace recklessly, missed the warning signs of thinning ice. The lead dogs broke through first, falling into the frigid water with a series of panicked yelps. Shadow reacted instantly, throwing his weight backward and digging his claws into the ice, halting the sled's momentum before more dogs could fall in. Weah, understanding immediately, secured the sled and rushed forward with a rope. Together, man and dog pulled the half-drowned huskies from the water. That night, as the team huddled in an emergency shelter, the hierarchy changed. Shiloh, still shivering despite the blanket Weah had wrapped around him, watched as the other dogs gathered closer to Shadow for warmth and reassurance. No words were exchanged, but a new respect filled the shelter. Shadow had taken his first step toward leadership not through aggression, but through courage and quick thinking. Something primal and long dormant had awakened within him, an ability to command not through fear but through action. It was a turning point from which there would be no return. The transformation of Shadow from domestic companion to wilderness survivor continued through the harsh Montana winter. Each run strengthened his body, each challenge sharpened his mind. Though he still dreamed of Judge Cooper's warm study and Ayanna's gentle hands, those memories began to feel increasingly distant, like stories told about someone else's life. The mail route took the team through some of the most remote terrain in the northern Rockies. They delivered supplies to fire watchtowers perched on lonely peaks, medicine to elderly trappers in hidden valleys, and letters to the scattered members of Weah's tribe who preferred traditional isolation to reservation life. Shadow came to recognize each stop, each scent, each danger along their path. Weah's respect for the German Shepherd grew with each successful journey. Unlike the other handlers Shadow had encountered since his abduction, Weah never used force to control his team. He spoke to the dogs as equals, explaining their route each morning as if they could understand every word. With Shadow, he seemed especially communicative. "Big storm coming from the north," he would say, kneeling beside Shadow before a run. "We'll take the lower pass today, safer that way." Shadow often wondered if Weah knew how much he understood, or if the mail carrier simply talked to fill the silence of the wilderness. Either way, Shadow appreciated being treated with dignity after the cruelty he had endured. Spring arrived reluctantly in the high country. Patches of wildflowers appeared between lingering snowdrifts, and the frozen lakes began their annual thaw. With the changing season came new challenges: mud that could mire a sled to its runners, swollen creeks that required careful crossing, and bears emerging hungry from hibernation. It was on a mild April morning when Shadow's newfound skills faced their greatest test. The team was crossing a narrow ridge trail with a steep drop to their right. Shyla, still lead dog despite the shifting respect of the team, suddenly stopped, ears pricked forward. Ahead, a massive grizzly sow with 2 cubs blocked the path, her posture clearly threatening. Shyla trembled visibly, caught between the instinct to flee and the training to hold position. Behind him, the other dogs began to whimper and pull backward in their harnesses, threatening to drag the sled and Weya over the edge. Shadow assessed the situation with remarkable clarity. The narrow trail offered no room to turn the sled around, and retreating backward would likely end in disaster. The bear, protecting her cubs, would charge if they advanced. They were effectively trapped. Acting on instinct, Shadow slipped out of his harness with a quick twist, a trick he'd been practicing in secret. Before Weya could react, Shadow moved forward past the other dogs, positioning himself between the team and the bear. He didn't growl or bark, but instead lowered his head and shoulders in a non-threatening posture while maintaining direct eye contact with the sow. The grizzly rose to her full height, nearly 8 feet tall, and roared a warning. Shadow held his ground. Behind him, Weya watched in astonishment, one hand on his rifle, but knowing a shot might only worsen the situation. For what seemed like an eternity, dog and bear engaged in a silent standoff. Then, remarkably, Shadow began to back up slowly, maintaining his submissive posture. The bear, perhaps confused by this unusual behavior, dropped to all fours and huffed. Shadow continued his careful retreat until he was even with Shyla. Then, using his body, he gradually guided the entire team into a slow backward movement. Inch by inch, they retreated around a bend in the trail until the bears were no longer visible. Only then did Shadow allow Weya to rehitch him to the sled. The mail carrier's hands trembled slightly as he secured the harness. "I've never seen anything like that," he murmured. "You just saved all our lives." News of the encounter spread quickly among the scattered homesteaders and outposts along their route. The story grew with each telling, Shadow becoming larger and more fearless, the bear more ferocious. By the time the tale reached the nearest town, Shadow had practically wrestled the grizzly into submission. The reality was more subtle but no less significant. Shadow had demonstrated a level of intelligence and poise that transcended typical canine behavior. The other dogs sensed it, and their dynamics shifted further. Even Shyla, who had maintained his technical position as lead dog through intimidation, began deferring to Shadow in moments of uncertainty. This uneasy balance might have continued indefinitely had fate not intervened. One evening, as they returned to Weya's cabin, they found a government vehicle parked outside. A thin man in an official uniform waited on the porch, an envelope in his hand. "Kevin Mercer, United States Postal Service," the man announced as Weya approached. "I'm afraid I have some unfortunate news." Shadow listened intently as Mercer explained that budget cuts and the expansion of electronic communications had led to the discontinuation of several wilderness mail routes, including Weya's. The mail carrier would be offered a position at the regional sorting center, but the dog team would no longer be needed. "What happens to my dogs?" Weya asked, his voice tightly controlled. Mercer shifted uncomfortably. "The service can't maintain animals it doesn't need. You can keep 2 as pets if you relocate. The others will need to be rehomed or—" He left the alternative unspoken. That night, Weya sat on his cabin steps, the team gathered around him. For the first time, Shadow saw the stoic man's eyes glisten with unshed tears. "I won't abandon you," he promised them, his hand resting on Shadow's head. "I'll find a way." The solution came 3 days later in the form of a hunting outfitter named Curtis, who arrived with a wad of cash and a flatbed truck. Shadow felt an immediate aversion to the man. Something in his scent reminded him of the people who had abducted him from Judge Cooper's home. But Weah had few options if he wanted to keep the team together. "They're working dogs," Weah explained as Curtis inspected the team. "They need a job, a purpose, and they need to stay together. They're family now." Curtis nodded absently, his eyes calculating as he assessed each dog's physical condition. When he reached Shadow, he paused. "This one's different, not a typical sled dog. Where'd you get him?" "Does it matter? He's the best of the bunch, smart as any human I've met." Curtis's thin lips curved into what might generously be called a smile. "I'll take 'em all. My clients pay top dollar for authentic wilderness experiences. A dog team adds to the mystique." The exchange of money was quick, the goodbyes painful. Weah knelt before each dog, murmuring private words that sounded like blessings in his native language. When he reached Shadow, he pressed his forehead against the German shepherd's. "Watch over them," he whispered, "and remember who you are." Curtis's operation proved to be everything Shadow had feared. The dogs were housed in crude pens behind a cluster of rustic cabins that served as base camp for wealthy hunters. Their new owner used them primarily for transportation during hunting expeditions, but also as pack animals, forcing them to carry heavy loads of equipment and eventually bloody animal carcasses. The final insult came when Curtis began using them to track wounded game. Shadow, with his superior scenting abilities, was particularly valuable for this purpose. The first time he was forced to lead hunters to a wounded elk, the magnificent animal's eyes, filled with pain and fear, reminded him powerfully of the wild dignity he had seen in the grizzly sow. Something deep within Shadow rebelled at being used as a tool for such killing. Shyla, surprisingly, felt the same. The former lead dog had changed since their encounter with the bear, becoming more thoughtful and less aggressive. One night, as they lay in adjacent pens, the husky spoke to Shadow through subtle body signals. "This isn't what we were meant for," his posture seemed to say. "We deliver, we carry, we don't help destroy." Shadow agreed silently. Their shared distaste for their new role created an unexpected bond between former rivals. Together, they began looking for opportunities to subvert Curtis's commands, losing scent trails, leading hunters in circles, or simply refusing to move despite threatened punishment. Curtis's response was predictably brutal. Shadow bore the brunt of the man's anger, enduring beatings that would have broken a lesser dog. A particularly vicious kick left a permanent scar across his muzzle, but it also hardened his resolve. Each blow fueled a growing determination not just to escape, but to someday make Curtis pay for his cruelty. The opportunity for rebellion came during a late autumn expedition. Curtis had been hired by 3 executives from Minneapolis who wanted to bag a trophy wolf before the season ended. Shadow recognized the irony. He was being forced to help hunt the very creatures whose distant howls had begun to call to something primal in his blood. The hunting party set out before dawn, Shadow and Shyla in the lead with 3 other dogs harnessed behind them. Nicky and Sage had been left behind, deemed too old or too slow for this particular expedition. The trail led them deep into territory Shadow had never seen during his time with Weah, beyond the usual boundaries and dangerously close to areas marked as protected wolf habitat. Curtis had been drinking the night before, and his mood was foul. When Shadow hesitated at a fork in the trail, the man brought his whip down across the dog's shoulders. "Move, you worthless mutt, the wolves are heading north." Shadow exchanged a quick glance with Shyla. In that moment, a decision was made. Instead of north, Shadow deliberately led the party east, toward a box canyon he had glimpsed on a previous hunt. Behind him, Shyla maintained pace, understanding without words what Shadow intended. For hours they pulled the sled through increasingly difficult terrain. The hunters complained, but Curtis assured them the wolf pack was just ahead. By midday, they entered the canyon, a natural trap with steep walls and only one way in or out. Shadow stopped, refusing to go further. "What's wrong with these damn dogs?" one of the executives demanded. Curtis stumbled forward, raising his whip again. "They need motivation." The blow never fell. From the ridgeline above came a sound that froze every man in place, the howl of a wolf, answered by another, then another. The hunting party had indeed found wolves, but not in the way they had intended. They were surrounded. In the chaos that followed, as the men fired wildly at Shadows and accusations flew about who had led them into this trap, Shadow saw his chance. With a powerful lunge, he snapped his lead line and bolted for the canyon entrance. Shyla and the other dogs, inspired by his example, broke free as well, scattering in different directions. Shadow ran without destination or plan, driven only by the need to put distance between himself and Curtis. His powerful legs carried him over fallen logs and across icy streams, deeper into wilderness than he had ever ventured. Only when his muscles threatened to give out did he finally stop, collapsing beneath an overhanging rock as the season's first snow began to fall. For 3 days and nights Shadow survived on instinct alone, catching small prey when he could, drinking from half-frozen streams, sheltering in whatever cover he found. The elegant collar Weah had made him, inscribed with the mail carrier's contact information, caught on a branch and was lost. With it went the last physical connection to his life as a working dog. Hunger eventually drove him to risk approaching a thin plume of smoke rising from a hidden valley. Moving cautiously through the underbrush, Shadow discovered a small cabin, its chimney belching wood smoke, its windows glowing with lamplight. Years of harsh experience had taught him caution, but desperation overrode his fear. The cabin door opened as Shadow reached the clearing. An elderly man stood silhouetted against the warm light, a shotgun cradled loosely in his arms. His face, deeply lined and weathered, showed no surprise at finding a half-starved German shepherd on his doorstep. "Well," the man said simply, "I was wondering when you'd decide to show yourself. Been watching you circle the place since sundown." Shadow remained tense, ready to flee at the first threatening move. "No need for that," the man continued, as if reading the dog's thoughts. "Dakota doesn't harm those who come in peace." The old man stepped back, holding the door open in clear invitation. A gust of wind carried the scents of wood fire, cooking meat, and something else. Something familiar that Shadow couldn't immediately place. Cautiously, he stepped forward into the warmth of the cabin. The interior was simple but comfortable, a single room with a bed against one wall, a wood stove, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with books and curious objects Shadow didn't recognize. Animal hides covered portions of the plank floor, and bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters. "Hungry, I expect," Dakota said, closing the door against the cold. He moved to the stove and lifted the lid on a pot, releasing a cloud of savory steam. "Got venison stew, old Makwa. That's the grizzly sow who lives on the ridge. She took down a buck yesterday, left me half, as she usually does. We have an understanding, her and I." Shadow watched in wary fascination as the old man ladled stew into a wooden bowl and set it on the floor. The mention of the bear, could it be the same one he had encountered with Weah's team, was less surprising than the casual way Dakota spoke of sharing a kill with the fearsome creature. "Eat," Dakota encouraged, settling into a chair with his own bowl. "Then we'll see about those wounds of yours." The stew was the most nourishing meal Shadow had eaten in months. As he licked the bowl clean, he felt some of his strength returning. Dakota watched him with keen eyes that seemed to look beyond physical appearance. "You've had a long journey, haven't you? Not just these last days, but from before. I can see it in your eyes. Old before your time, like me." The man chuckled softly. But your journey isn't over yet, not by a long way." That night, Shadow slept deeply for the first time since leaving Weya's cabin, curled on a bearskin rug near the stove. In his dreams he ran through endless forests, alongside shadowy figures that moved like dogs, but weren't dogs at all. They accepted him as one of their own, this strange pack that called to him with voices like the wind. When he woke, Dakota was already up, watching him with that same penetrating gaze. "You heard them, didn't you? In your dreams?" The old man nodded as if Shadow had answered. "They've been watching you since you came into these mountains. The people of the Long Tooth. My grandfather's people called them brothers." Shadow didn't understand the words, but something in Dakota's tone resonated with the dream that still clung to the edges of his consciousness. The old man rose and opened the cabin door. Outside, the world was transformed by a fresh blanket of snow that sparkled in the morning sun. "Come," Dakota said. "There's someone you should meet." Shadow followed Dakota through the pristine snow, each paw print marking his passage through a world transformed by winter's first serious storm. The old man moved with surprising agility for his age, navigating the forest paths without hesitation, despite the snow that obscured most landmarks. They climbed steadily upward, following a ridgeline that offered occasional glimpses of the valley below and the distant peaks beyond. After nearly an hour of hiking, Dakota stopped at the edge of a small clearing. The wind had sculpted the snow into graceful drifts around a cluster of granite boulders. The old man gestured for Shadow to remain still, then produced a small wooden flute from inside his coat. The haunting melody he played seemed to float across the clearing, at once a question and an invitation. For several minutes after the music ended, nothing happened. Shadow's ears pricked forward at small sounds, the whisper of wind through pines, the distant crack of ice on a frozen stream. Then, almost imperceptibly, shapes began to materialize along the tree line on the opposite side of the clearing. Wolves. 5 of them, moving like smoke between the trees. Their thick winter coats were various shades of gray and brown, their eyes alert and intelligent as they observed the man and dog. The largest, a male with a distinctive white blaze on his chest, stepped slightly ahead of the others. "That's Akule," Dakota said softly. "He leads this pack. His father led before him and his grandfather before that. My people have known this bloodline since before there were towns in these mountains." Shadow stood transfixed. He had caught glimpses of wolves during his time with Weya's team and had heard their distant howls nearly every night since arriving in Montana, but he had never been this close, never seen them so clearly. Something about them called to him in a way he couldn't articulate, a recognition beyond words or conscious thought. "They normally avoid humans," Dakota continued. "Too many have fallen to hunters' rifles over the years. But this pack knows me. My grandfather was a wolf dreamer, what the white men would call a spirit guide for the wolf clans. When he died, that responsibility passed to my father and then to me." Clay stepped forward, his movements cautious but not fearful. Shadow tensed, unsure whether to retreat behind Dakota or stand his ground. Some deep instinct told him that showing fear now would be a mistake. "Be still," Dakota advised, though he made no move to restrain Shadow. "Let him come to you." The wolf approached slowly, stopping about 10 feet away. His amber eyes locked with Shadow's in a gaze that seemed to probe beyond surface appearances. Shadow felt as if he were being evaluated, measured against some unknown standard. After a long moment, Akula turned his attention to Dakota, uttering a soft whine. "Yes, he's the one I told you about," the old man said, as if continuing a conversation. "Found him half dead on my doorstep. He's known men's cruelty, but hasn't let it poison his spirit." Shadow watched this bizarre exchange with growing bewilderment. The old man spoke to the wolf as casually as he might speak to a neighbor, and stranger still, the wolf seemed to understand. After another long look at Shadow, Akihel turned and trotted back to his pack. With a flick of his tail, he led them back into the forest, disappearing as silently as they had come. "They'll be watching you," Dakota said as they made their way back toward the cabin. "Wolves are cautious by nature. They won't accept you immediately, but they recognize something in you, something beyond your dog breeding." Over the following weeks, Shadow's strength returned under Dakota's care. The old man treated his wounds with poultices made from forest plants, fed him well, and allowed him the freedom to come and go as he pleased. Unlike his previous handlers, Dakota made no attempt to leash or contain him. The cabin door was left ajar during the day, allowing Shadow to explore the surrounding wilderness at will. He often caught glimpses of Akule's pack moving through the trees or crossing distant meadows. Sometimes he would follow their tracks, learning their hunting routes and preferred territories. The wolves, for their part, seemed to tolerate his presence at a distance, neither welcoming nor threatening him. December brought deeper snow and bitter cold. Dakota's cabin became a welcome sanctuary each evening, its wood stove radiating heat that banished the chill from Shadow's bones. The old man spent the long winter nights carving intricate figures from wood or telling stories to which Shadow listened attentively, finding comfort in the cadence of human speech, even if he couldn't understand every word. "My grandfather believed that wolves and humans once spoke the same language," Dakota said one evening as they sat before the fire. "In the very beginning, before greed and fear drove us apart, the elders say that occasionally a special child would be born who remembered that ancient tongue, a wolf speaker who could bridge the gap between our worlds." He studied Shadow thoughtfully. "I think sometimes animals remember what humans have forgotten. You're not quite wolf, not quite dog, caught between worlds, like me, too wild for the town, too civilized for the deep forest." As if to emphasize this point, Shadow's dreams that night were filled with disjointed images. Judge Cooper's library with its leather chairs and crackling hearth, Ayana brushing his coat in the summer sunshine, Wea's team pulling the mail sled through a mountain pass, Curtis's whip descending toward his face. He woke with a start, his heart racing, to find Dakota watching him from across the room. "The past doesn't let go easily," the old man observed, "for either of us." January brought a prolonged cold snap that drove even the hardiest wildlife to seek shelter. Game became scarce, and Shadow often returned from his daily explorations, having found nothing worth chasing. One afternoon, however, he picked up an unexpected scent. Wolf, but tinged with blood and something else. Fear? Following the scent, Shadow discovered one of the younger members of Akule's pack lying in the snow beneath a rocky overhang. The young male's leg was caught in a steel trap, the cruel device partially buried under fresh snow. Blood stained the ground around him, and his eyes rolled wildly as Shadow approached. Years of civilized living warred with newfound instinct. The old Shadow, Judge Cooper's pampered pet, would have run back to the nearest human for help. But the creature he was becoming understood that there wasn't time. The trapped wolf had already lost blood and would soon succumb to cold or attract predators. Moving deliberately, Shadow approached the panicked wolf. A warning growl rumbled from the injured animal's throat, but Shadow continued his advance, his posture submissive but determined. When he was close enough to touch the trap, he paused, allowing the wolf to sniff him and recognize that he intended no harm. The trap was similar to ones Curtis had sometimes used, a simple spring mechanism with a release lever. Shadow had watched the hunters set and disarm them dozens of times. Carefully, using his teeth and paws, he pressed the lever down. The jaws of the trap sprang open, releasing the wolf's mangled leg. Free but badly injured, the young wolf tried to stand, only to collapse again. Shadow moved to his side, offering his body as support. Together they began the slow journey back toward Dakota's cabin. Night had fallen by the time they emerged from the trees into the clearing around the cabin. Shadow's fur was matted with the other wolf's blood, and both animals were exhausted from the difficult trek. The cabin door opened before they reached it, Tekota's silhouette backlit by the warm glow of the wood stove. "I was beginning to worry," the old man said, then fell silent as he took in the scene before him. Without another word, he helped Shadow guide the injured wolf into the cabin and onto a bed of furs near the stove. "A trap," Tekota muttered as he examined the wound. "Illegal on these lands. The work of poachers, most likely." He set about cleaning and treating the injury with the same gentle efficiency he had shown for Shadow's wounds. "You did well to bring him here. Another hour in that trap and he would have been lost." 3 days later, the injured wolf, whom Tekota called Maska, was strong enough to stand but still too weak to return to the wild. During this time, an extraordinary thing happened. Akule and 2 other pack members appeared at the edge of the clearing, watching the cabin with unwavering attention. On the 4th morning, Tekota opened the door to find a freshly killed rabbit on the threshold. "A gift," the old man explained, bringing the offering inside, "and a message. They know you helped one of their own." That evening, as Maska rested comfortably by the fire, Tekota revealed more of his history to Shadow. "I wasn't always a hermit," he began, his voice taking on the rhythmic quality of a practiced storyteller. "Once I had a family, a job in town, a normal life. My wife, she was a biologist, studied wolves for the university. We lived on the edge of the reservation, 1 foot in the white man's world, 1 foot in the traditional ways." Shadow settled on his bearskin, watching the play of emotions across the old man's face as he continued. 30 years ago, the state decided to allow wolf hunting again after decades of protection. Catherine, my wife, fought against it, testified at hearings, wrote papers, organized protests, made powerful enemies. Tekota's eyes grew distant. One night, she went to check on a denning site where a wolf had just whelped pups. She never came home. They found her truck at the trailhead, but no body. The official report called it a hiking accident, maybe a bear attack, but I knew better. His gnarled hands clenched into fists. There were men in town, men who'd threatened her, who'd said the only good wolf was a dead wolf, the same men who now run those fancy hunting outfits, charging rich folks thousands to kill animals they don't need and won't eat. Shadow understood more than Tekota realized. The pattern of men like Curtis, who used animals and discarded them, who killed for pleasure rather than necessity, was familiar to him now. "After that, I couldn't live among people anymore," Tekota concluded. "I came up here to my grandfather's old trapping cabin, intending to find the men responsible and make them pay. But something else happened instead." He glanced at Maska, now sleeping peacefully. "The wolves found me. Somehow they knew Catherine had tried to protect them. They began bringing me gifts, a share of their kills. One old female would even let me approach her cubs." He smiled at the memory. "My grandfather's teachings came back to me then. Violence only creates more violence. So, instead of vengeance, I chose guardianship. I've been watching over this territory ever since, keeping track of the packs, sabotaging illegal traps, guiding the wolves away from hunters when necessary." Before Shadow could absorb this revelation, a sound outside the cabin froze them both. The crunch of boots on snow. Tekota moved to the window, peering carefully through a gap in the curtains. "Trouble," he whispered. "2 men with rifles, moving like they don't want to be heard." Shadow joined him at the window. Even in the dim moonlight, he recognized the distinctive shape of Curtis's broad shoulders. The second man was unfamiliar, taller and leaner than Curtis, but moving with similar predatory purpose. "Poachers," Tekota muttered. "After wolves, most likely. Must have found some of my disabled traps and followed the signs to the cabin." He reached for his shotgun, then hesitated. "No, there's been enough killing in these mountains." Instead, the old man moved swiftly to gather supplies, food, medical kit, extra clothing, into a pack. "We need to leave, now. There's a back way through the root cellar. We can reach the high caves before they realize we're gone." Shadow whined softly, looking at Maska, who had awakened and was watching them with alert eyes. "Yes, he comes too," Dakota agreed. "He's strong enough to move if we help him." Together they made their way through a trap door hidden beneath a bearskin rug, down a short ladder, and into a narrow tunnel that smelled of earth and roots. Behind them they heard the cabin door being kicked open, followed by angry shouts. The tunnel emerged in a dense thicket nearly 100 yards from the cabin. From this vantage point they saw Curtis and his companion searching the cabin, occasionally visible through the windows as they moved from room to room. After several minutes, Curtis emerged onto the porch, his face twisted with rage. "Find something to burn," he called to his partner. "If the old Indian won't tell us where the wolf pack's den, we'll smoke him out of hiding." Dakota's face hardened as he watched flames begin to lick at the walls of the cabin that had been his home for 3 decades. "Come," he said quietly. "We need to reach the high ground before dawn." They traveled through the night, Shadow and Dakota taking turns supporting Maska when the injured wolf's strength flagged. As the first light of dawn painted the eastern sky, they reached a series of caves set into a cliff face overlooking a vast valley. From this elevated position, they could see for miles, including the thin column of smoke still rising from what remained of Dakota's cabin. "Fools," the old man said, though whether he meant Curtis and his companion or himself was unclear. "They think destroying my home will drive me away. They don't understand that my home is the entire mountain." Inside the largest cave they found evidence that Dakota had prepared for such an emergency. Stacked neatly against one wall were containers of water, preserved food, blankets, and other supplies. A natural chimney in the rock ceiling would allow them to have a small fire without the smoke being visible from below. As Dakota set about making the cave habitable, Shadow moved to the entrance, gazing down at the valley where he could just make out 2 small figures making their way along a trail far below. Curtis and his companion had apparently given up searching the immediate area around the cabin and were heading back toward their camp. Something cold and implacable settled in Shadow's heart as he watched them go. In the span of less than a year, he had been stolen from his home, beaten, exploited, and finally hunted. The men retreating down the mountain represented everything that had been taken from him, and from Dakota, and from the wolves whose territory was increasingly threatened by human encroachment. For the first time, Shadow understood with perfect clarity what he had become. Not just a survivor, but a guardian. Like Dakota, he had found himself caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. And like Dakota, he had a choice to make about how to use the strength and intelligence that had carried him this far. As if sensing his thoughts, Maska limped to his side, leaning lightly against him in a gesture that was neither fully wolf nor fully dog, but something in between, an acknowledgment of kinship that transcended species. Together they watched the distant figures until they disappeared into the forest below, each nursing a silent promise that this confrontation was far from over. For 3 weeks the cave became their sanctuary. Dakota ventured out daily to check his trap lines for food and to monitor the movements of Curtis and his companion, who had established a hunting camp in the valley below. Shadow split his time between helping the old man gather supplies and staying with Maska, whose strength returned slowly but steadily. By the full moon the young wolf was able to walk without assistance, though the damaged leg would always bear the scar of his ordeal. During this time, Akula's pack maintained a watchful presence around the cave system. They never approached closely while Tako was present, but Shadow would often wake in the night to find silent visitors observing them from just beyond the cave mouth. Sometimes the wolves left offerings, a rabbit or squirrel placed carefully where Shadow would find it at first light. "They're acknowledging you," Dakota explained when Shadow brought one such gift to his attention. "Not as a pack member, not yet, but as an ally. That's rare. Most wolves would view a dog as a threat or a competitor. One morning, Dakota returned from his dawn patrol with a worried expression. "There's sickness in the high valley," he reported, removing his snowshoes and settling by the small fire Shadow had maintained. "Spotted a cow elk, stumbling, foaming at the mouth. Bad sign." Later that day, they heard gunshots echoing through the mountains. Not the methodical shots of hunters tracking game, but the panicked, rapid fire of men in danger. Shadow's ears pricked forward, catching faint sounds of shouting. "Fools must have found the sick elk," Dakota muttered. "Any hunter worth his salt knows better than to disturb an animal showing those symptoms." That evening, as they shared a meager meal of smoked fish and pine needle tea, Dakota seemed unusually contemplative. "I need to go down to the trading post," he finally said. "We're running low on supplies, and I need to send word to a friend at the university about the sick elk. Could be something that needs attention before it spreads to the wolf packs." Shadow whined softly, torn between staying with Maska and accompanying the old man on what could be a dangerous journey. "No, old friend," Dakota said, correctly interpreting Shadow's concern. "You stay here. Someone needs to look after our guest, and you're better equipped to protect him if trouble comes. I'll be back in 3 days. 4 at most." The next morning, Dakota departed with his pack and rifle, leaving Shadow and Maska to guard the cave. The day passed uneventfully, and by nightfall Shadow had settled into a watchful routine, venturing out occasionally to patrol the perimeter before returning to the warmth of the cave. On the second day, however, a storm rolled in from the northwest, bringing driving snow and winds that howled through the mountain passes like tortured spirits. Shadow huddled with Maska near the back of the cave, both animals instinctively seeking the most protected spot as temperatures plummeted. By the morning of the third day, Shadow was worried. The storm showed no signs of abating, and Dakota had yet to return. Worse, their supply of firewood was dwindling rapidly. If the old man didn't make it back soon, they would face a choice between freezing in the cave or braving the blizzard to seek new shelter. Just after midday, as Shadow was considering his options, Maska suddenly lifted his head, ears pricked forward intently. A moment later, Shadow caught it too. A scent carried on the wind. Faint but unmistakable. Human. Not Dakota's familiar wood smoke and leather, but something harsher. Chemical. Gun oil. Moving cautiously to the cave entrance, Shadow peered out into the swirling snow. At first he saw nothing. Then a dark shape materialized on the path below. A man struggling upward against the wind, a rifle slung across his back. Curtis! Shadow retreated into the cave, his mind racing. How had the hunter found them? Had he somehow tracked Dakota to the trading post and forced him to reveal their location? Or was this simply bad luck? Curtis seeking shelter from the storm in caves he knew existed? Either way, Shadow needed to act quickly. He nudged Maska toward a smaller side chamber they had discovered days earlier, a narrow crevice barely large enough for the wolf to squeeze through. Once Maska was safely hidden, Shadow considered his own options. He could hide as well, but something told him that Curtis wouldn't stop searching until he'd explored every inch of the cave system. Instead, Shadow positioned himself just inside the main entrance, his dark coat blending with the shadows. If Curtis entered, he would find the cave apparently empty at first glance. Shadow would have the element of surprise and, just maybe, the advantage. The minutes stretched painfully as Curtis drew nearer. Shadow could hear the man's labored breathing now, the crunch of his boots on snow-covered rock. Then a silhouette appeared at the cave mouth, momentarily blocking the gray light of the storm. "Hello, the cave," Curtis called, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "Dakota, I know you're in there, old man." Receiving no answer, Curtis advanced cautiously into the cave. He carried his rifle at the ready, his finger hovering near the trigger. Snow melted from his heavy coat, dripping onto the cave floor as he moved deeper into the darkness. "Come on out. I'm not here to hurt you. Just need shelter from this damn storm." Shadow remained motionless, scarcely breathing as the hunter passed within feet of his hiding place. He caught the familiar odor of whiskey on Curtis's breath, a scent that triggered memories of pain and fear from his time at the hunting camp. Curtis moved toward the small fire pit where the embers of their last fire still glowed faintly. He crouched, holding his hands toward the meager warmth. "Well, well," he murmured, "someone's been here recently." He rose and began a more thorough exploration of the cave, his flashlight beam probing the darkness. Shadow tensed as the light approached the crevice where Maska was hidden. If Curtis discovered the wolf— "I know you found my trap line, old man," Curtis called out, his voice taking on an edge of anger. "Those were expensive traps you ruined. We could have settled this peacefully, but you had to make it difficult." The flashlight beam swept past the crevice without pausing. Curtis hadn't spotted Maska. Shadow felt a momentary relief, but it was short-lived. The hunter was now moving back toward the entrance, and Shadow's hiding place. Just as discovery seemed inevitable, a new sound reached them, a long, mournful howl that seemed to come from directly outside the cave. Curtis froze, then swung around, his rifle raised. "Wolves," he whispered, a note of fear creeping into his voice. The howl came again, joined by another, then another, until the air vibrated with their eerie chorus. Shadow recognized those voices. Aku's pack had arrived. Curtis backed away from the entrance, his earlier bravado evaporating. "Just wolves," he muttered to himself. "Just stupid animals. They won't come in here." But even as he spoke, a large gray form appeared at the cave mouth. Aku stood framed against the swirling snow, his amber eyes reflecting the faint light from Curtis's flashlight. Behind him, shadowy figures moved, the rest of the pack, positioning themselves to block any escape. Curtis raised his rifle. "Stay back!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "I'll shoot!" Shadow made his decision in that instant. Breaking from his hiding place, he lunged across the cave, slamming into Curtis's legs with all the force he could muster. The hunter toppled backward, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the cave ceiling. Before he could recover, Shadow was on him, teeth bared, inches from the man's throat. "The judge's dog?" Curtis gasped, recognition dawning in his eyes. "It can't be." Shadow growled, a deep, rumbling sound that conveyed years of accumulated rage. One quick movement and he could tear out the hunter's throat, end the threat forever. Curtis seemed to realize this, too. A damp stain spread across the front of his pants as terror overtook him. In that moment, with his enemy helpless beneath him, Shadow hesitated. Images flashed through his mind. Judge Cooper teaching him to retrieve without marking the bird. Ayana gently dressing his paw when he'd cut it on broken glass. Weah sharing his meager rations during a blizzard. The humans who had shown him kindness and dignity had also taught him something Curtis would never understand. Mercy. Shadow backed away, maintaining his threatening posture but allowing Curtis to scramble into a sitting position. The hunter's eyes darted frantically from Shadow to Aku, who still guarded the entrance with unwavering focus. "What do you want?" Curtis whispered, addressing the question to Shadow as if expecting the dog to answer. From the small crevice came movement. Maska emerged, limping slightly but standing tall, his yellow eyes fixed on Curtis. The hunter's gaze dropped to the wolf's injured leg, then to the distinctive trap mark still visible in the healing wound. "Oh, God," he murmured, "you're the ones who've been sabotaging my traps." Shadow moved to Maska's side, standing shoulder to shoulder with a wolf in a display of solidarity that transcended species. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but within the cave, a different kind of storm was brewing, a reckoning long overdue. The standoff in the cave lasted through the worst of the blizzard. Curtis, disarmed and terrified, huddled against the far wall while Shadow, Maska, and Aku maintained their vigilant watch. The rest of the wolf pack patrolled just outside, their occasional shadows passing across the cave entrance like silent sentinels. As the storm began to subside on the following day, a new tension filled the air. Shadow sensed it first. A change in Akalev's posture, a heightened alertness that spread through the pack. Someone was coming. Moments later, Shadow caught the scent. Dakota, but not alone. Another human accompanied him, their scent vaguely familiar yet impossible to place. Curtis noticed the shift in the animal's attention. "What is it?" he demanded, his voice hoarse from thirst. "More your wolf friends coming to decide my fate?" Shadow ignored him, focusing instead on the approaching figures now visible through the thinning snowfall. Dakota appeared first, his familiar silhouette unmistakable despite the heavy pack he carried. Behind him came a slender figure in modern winter gear, moving with the confident stride of someone accustomed to mountain terrain. Akuli greeted Dakota with a respectful distance, allowing the old man and his companion to pass into the cave. The wolves outside maintained their positions, neither retreating nor threatening as the humans entered. "I see you've had company while I was gone," Dakota observed dryly, surveying the scene. Curtis pressed against the wall, Shadow and Maska standing guard. "And you've handled it well." His companion pulled back her hood, revealing the face of a young woman with copper skin and high cheekbones. Her dark hair was tied in a practical braid, and her eyes, intelligent and observant, widened at the sight of Shadow. "It can't be," she whispered, taking a half-step forward. Shadow froze, his entire body suddenly electric with recognition. The scent, the voice. Memories long buried surged to the surface. Ayanna, Judge Cooper's daughter. "You know this dog?" Dakota asked, setting down his pack. Ayanna nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving Shadow. "If it's who I think it is. But it's impossible. Shadow disappeared over a year ago. We searched everywhere." At the sound of his name, his true name, Shadow felt something shift inside him. Without conscious thought, he moved toward Ayanna, his tail offering a tentative wag for the first time in months. "Shadow?" she repeated, kneeling to his level. "Is it really you?" He approached cautiously, allowing her to see the scar across his muzzle, the notch torn from his ear during one of Curtis's beatings, the gray now frosting his muzzle, all evidence of the hard road he had traveled. Ayanna reached out slowly, her fingers trembling as they made contact with his fur. She inhaled sharply. "It is you," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. "Father said you must have been killed, but I never believed it." Curtis chose that moment to remind them of his presence. "Touching reunion," he sneered, some of his bravado returning now that other humans were present. "But if you people think you can hold me here against my will, you're mistaken. My partner knows where I am. He'll bring help." "Your partner won't be bringing anyone anywhere," Dakota replied evenly. "He's currently enjoying the hospitality of the tribal police down at the reservation. Seems he was caught placing illegal traps on protected land. When they searched his vehicle, they found evidence connecting him to several other interesting activities." The old man turned to Ayanna. "Miss Cooper here works with the Wildlife Management Division. I encountered her at the trading post, where she was posting notices about the elk disease outbreak. When I mentioned Curtis's hunting operation, she was quite interested." Ayanna's expression hardened as she looked at Curtis. "We've had reports of illegal hunting and trapping in this area for months, but we could never catch anyone in the act." Her gaze returned to Shadow, softening. "I never imagined I'd find you in the process." "Cooper?" Curtis repeated, his face draining of color. "You're the judge's daughter?" "I am," she confirmed, "though I'm here in my professional capacity." Curtis seemed to deflate, slumping against the wall. "I should have known. That dog," he gestured at Shadow, "looked familiar the first time I saw him with Way's mail team, but I never made the connection." Ayanna's expression reflected confusion. "Mail team? What are you talking about?" Over the next hour, the full story emerged in pieces. Curtis revealing his part in purchasing Shadow and the other sled dogs after the mail route was discontinued. Dakota explaining how Shadow had appeared at his cabin. and finally the confrontation that had led to the current standoff. Throughout the conversation, Shadow remained close to Ayanna, occasionally glancing toward Maska and Akole as if to reassure them. "There's one piece still missing," Ayanna said finally. "How did Shadow end up with a mail carrier in the first place? He was stolen from our home last winter." Curtis shifted uncomfortably. "Wasn't me. Must have been my brother-in-law, Redford. He handles the acquisition of special dogs sometimes." "Redford?" Ayanna's voice sharpened. "Redford Cooper?" Curtis blinked in surprise. "You know him?" "He's my uncle," she said coldly. "My father's estranged brother. We haven't seen him in 20 years, not since the court case." A bitter laugh escaped Curtis. "Well, ain't that something? Redford never mentioned the dog belonged to his own brother. Just said it was from someone who needed to be taught a lesson." Shadow watched understanding dawn on Ayanna's face. The realization that her own uncle had orchestrated Shadow's abduction as an act of revenge against her father. Her hands trembled as she stroked Shadow's fur, as if reassuring herself that he was truly there, alive despite everything. "Where is Redford now?" she asked quietly. Curtis shrugged. "Haven't seen him in months. He comes and goes. Might be in Canada by now. He's got connections with some outfitters up there." A sudden commotion outside interrupted their conversation. The wolves, previously silent, began a chorus of warning growls. Dakota moved to the cave entrance, peering out into the fading daylight. "Trouble," he announced. "Someone's coming up the trail, moving fast." Curtis's expression shifted to one of triumph. "That'll be the search party. Told you they'd come looking for me." Dakota shook his head. "Just one man, and he's armed." Ayanna joined him at the entrance, careful to keep her distance from the vigilant wolves. "I can't see clearly from here," she said, frustration evident in her voice. Shadow moved past them, stepping into the open where he could get a better view of the approaching figure. Despite the distance and the glare of afternoon sun on snow, there was something disturbingly familiar about the man's gait. A scent carried on the wind confirmed his suspicion. Gun oil, expensive cologne, and the faint metallic tang of hatred, the same scent that had clung to the men who had taken him from Judge Cooper's home. He turned back to the cave, his posture communicating urgency. Maska limped to his side, followed by Akul, all three animals now focused on the approaching threat. "What is it?" Dakota asked, reading Shadow's behavior. Ayanna understood first. "It's Redford, isn't it?" she whispered. "He's found us somehow." Curtis pushed himself to his feet. "If it's Redford, he's coming for me. We've got business interests together. He'll get me out of this mess." "I wouldn't count on that," Dakota said grimly. "Men like Redford look after themselves first, and if he thinks you've been talking—" The implications hung in the air, unspoken but clear. Curtis paled visibly. "We need to hide," Ayanna decided, looking around the cave. "If he hasn't seen us yet, maybe—" "Too late for that," Dakota interrupted. "Look." On the path below, Redford had stopped, staring directly at the cave entrance. He raised a hand in greeting, then continued his ascent with renewed purpose. "He's seen us," Ayanna said. "But how did he find this place?" "Radio tracker," Curtis admitted reluctantly. "In my gear. Standard procedure when we're hunting in pairs. If we get separated—" Dakota cursed softly. "And you didn't think to mention this earlier?" "Didn't think he'd come looking so soon," Curtis muttered. "Snowstorm and all?" Shadow moved back into the cave, positioning himself protectively in front of Ayanna. Whatever happened next, he wouldn't allow Redford to harm her. The memory of being torn from his home, from his family, burned fresh in his mind, fueling a determination that transcended fear. Maska and Akali flanked him, forming a living barrier between the humans and the cave entrance. Outside, the rest of the pack moved into strategic positions among the rocks, invisible to approaching eyes but ready to respond at their leader's signal. "He's got a rifle," Dakota warned, his voice low. "And I'd wager He knows how to use it." "So do I," Ayanna replied, surprising Shadow with her resolve. "But I'd rather not, if we can avoid it. He's still my father's brother, despite everything." Minutes later, Redford reached the cave mouth. He was taller than Curtis, but with the same hard eyes, his expensive outdoor gear marking him as someone who played at Wilderness rather than lived in it. The rifle he carried was similarly high-end, a hunter's status symbol as much as a tool. "Hello, brother's daughter," he called, his voice carrying a forced joviality that didn't reach his eyes. "It's been a long time." Ayanna stepped forward, careful to keep Shadow at her side. "Uncle Redford, this is an unexpected reunion." "Indeed." His gaze swept the cave, taking in Curtis, Dakota, and the 3 canines standing guard. "I see you've met my business associate and made some interesting friends of your own." "Your business associate has been telling us some fascinating stories," Ayanna replied evenly, "about illegal hunting operations, poaching on protected lands, dog theft." Redford's smile tightened. Curtis has always had an active imagination, especially when he's cornered. "It wasn't imagination that stole my father's dog," Ayanna countered, "or set illegal traps that are maiming wildlife across these mountains." For the first time, Redford seemed to truly notice Shadow. His eyes narrowed in recognition, then widened in apparent disbelief. "Well, I'll be damned," he murmured. "The judge's mutt survived after all. Tenacious beast." Shadow growled low in his throat, every muscle tense with the effort of restraining himself. This was the architect of his suffering, the man whose actions had torn him from everything he loved and set him on a path of pain and hardship. "You took him," Ayanna said, her voice trembling with suppressed anger, "to get back at my father, after all these years." Redford shrugged, unapologetic. "Your father took everything from me with that ruling, my land, my reputation, my future. Seemed only fair I take something precious from him in return." His cold gaze shifted to Shadow. "Though it appears I didn't finish the job properly." The tension in the cave was palpable as Redford's words hung in the air. Shadow's growl deepened, the sound reverberating off the stone walls like distant thunder. Beside him, Maska and Akuli stood rigid, their yellow eyes fixed on the newcomer, sensing the threat he represented not just to them, but to the entire pack. "Put the rifle down, Redford," Dakota said, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "No one needs to get hurt here." Redford's thin lips curved into a humorless smile. "I'm afraid I can't do that, old man. I've got too much invested in this operation to walk away now." His gaze shifted to Curtis. "And it seems my partner has been sharing information he shouldn't have." "I didn't tell them anything they didn't already know," Curtis protested, his earlier bravado entirely absent. "They caught Harley with the traps. Game's up, Redford." "The game's only up when I say it is," Redford replied coldly. He gestured with the rifle toward the cave entrance. "Everyone outside, now! We're going to have a little walk down to my cabin." "And then what?" Ayanna challenged, her hand resting protectively on Shadow's head. "You can't possibly think you'll get away with this. The authorities already know about your illegal operations." "The authorities know what I want them to know," Redford countered. "When we're found tragically killed in an avalanche, a common enough occurrence in these mountains, they'll close their investigation, particularly when certain officials receive their usual payments for looking the other way." Shadow felt Ayanna's fingers tighten in his fur. The fear in her scent was unmistakable, but so was her determination. She wouldn't submit easily to her uncle's threats. Neither would Dakota, who had shifted almost imperceptibly to position himself between Redford and the others. "You've lived too long in cities, Redford," the old man said. "You've forgotten the first rule of the wilderness. Never corner something that can bite back." As if on cue, a chorus of howls erupted from outside the cave. Not the distant calls Shadow had grown accustomed to, but the close, coordinated sounds of a pack preparing to hunt. Redford's head jerked toward the entrance, momentary uncertainty crossing his features. "Just wolves," he said dismissively, though his knuckles whitened around the rifle stock. "They won't come near humans with firearms." "These wolves might surprise you," Dakota replied. "They've learned that men with guns are the most dangerous prey of all, and the most satisfying to bring down." For the first time, genuine fear flickered in Redford's eyes. He took a half-step back, then steeled himself, raising the rifle to his shoulder. "Enough games. Outside, all of you. The wolves won't attack a group." What happened next seemed to unfold in slow motion. As Redford gestured with the rifle, his finger tensing on the trigger, Shadow launched himself forward. Not at Redford, as every instinct demanded, but at Ayanna, knocking her sideways just as the rifle discharged. The bullet struck the cave wall where she had been standing, sending stone fragments flying like shrapnel. Chaos erupted. Dakota dove for cover as Redford swung the rifle toward him. Curtis, seizing the opportunity, lunged for the cave entrance. Akale and his pack moved as one to block his escape, herding him back inside with snapping teeth and bristling fur. In the confusion, Shadow focused solely on Ayanna, shielding her body with his own, as a second shot echoed through the cave. The bullet went wide, but the message was clear. Redford had nothing left to lose. "Next one won't miss," he snarled, aiming the rifle directly at Ayanna. "Call off your wolf friends, old man, or your young protégé dies first." Through the thunder of his own heartbeat, Shadow heard a new sound, soft, deliberate footsteps approaching from the deeper recesses of the cave system. A familiar scent reached his nostrils moments before a figure emerged from the shadows behind Redford. "Drop the weapon, Redford," came a commanding voice that Shadow had not heard in over a year, a voice he had once feared he would never hear again. Judge William Cooper stood tall, despite his 65 years, a revolver held steady in hands that had once scratched Shadow's ears each evening by the fire. His silver hair was longer than Shadow remembered, his face more deeply lined, but his eyes, those piercing blue eyes that had always seemed to see straight through pretense, were unchanged. Redford spun toward his brother, momentarily forgetting the others. "William," he breathed, genuine shock replacing his calculated menace. "How—" "I followed my daughter," Judge Cooper explained simply. "When she told me she was investigating illegal hunting near Dakota's territory, I knew there was a chance you might be involved. Some patterns never change, do they, little brother?" Redford's expression hardened. "Like your pattern of self-righteousness? 20 years, William. 20 years since you ruled against me, took my land, destroyed everything I'd built." "I rule according to the law," the judge replied evenly. "The land you claimed had been part of the reservation for generations. The documentation you presented was fraudulent, and you knew it." "It was business," Redford shouted, his composure cracking. "Just business. But you always had to play the righteous protector of the downtrodden, didn't you? Father's perfect son, the incorruptible judge." Shadow watched the brothers' confrontation with growing understanding. Here was the root of all that had happened, a decades-old grievance that had festered until it poisoned everything it touched, even reaching across generations to harm those who had no part in the original conflict. "Put down the rifle, Redford," Judge Cooper said again, his voice gentler now. "It's over. No one else needs to get hurt." For a moment it seemed Redford might comply. The rifle barrel dipped slightly, his shoulders slumping with the weight of inevitability. Then, with a sudden cry of rage, he swung the weapon toward his brother. Shadow moved without conscious thought, years of protective instinct overcoming even his newfound wild nature. He launched himself at Redford, a black streak of fur and muscle and righteous fury. His jaws closed not around the man's throat, a killing bite that every fiber of his being demanded, but around the rifle barrel, wrenching it upward as it discharged into the cave ceiling. The impact of the recoil against his teeth sent waves of pain through Shadow's skull, but he didn't release his grip. Redford staggered backward, trying to shake free the 100-plus pounds of determined German shepherd. His heel caught on a rock and he went down hard, Shadow still clinging to the rifle. Judge Cooper was there in an instant, kicking the weapon from his brother's grasp. Ayanna appeared at his side, a length of climbing rope in her hands. Together they secured Redford's wrists, while Dakota did the same for Curtis, who had sunk to his knees in defeat. Only when both men were restrained did Shadow finally release the rifle, backing away to stand protectively between the captives and his reunited family. His muzzle throbbed where the metal had struck bone, but the pain was secondary to the surge of satisfaction that flowed through him. The circle had closed. Justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. As if sensing the shift in energy, Akuli approached cautiously, stopping just short of the humans. The wolf's posture conveyed not aggression, but curiosity, and perhaps respect. Behind him, the rest of the pack watched from the cave entrance, their eyes reflecting the fading daylight like dozens of golden lamps. Judge Cooper stared in amazement at this gathering, the wolves, the old man, and most of all, the dog he had given up for dead now standing before him, scarred but unbowed. "Shadow," he whispered, kneeling slowly and holding out a hand. "You impossible, wonderful animal." Shadow approached his former master with measured steps. The judge smelled the same. Leather-bound books, pipe tobacco, and the faint aftershave he'd used for as long as Shadow could remember. But there was something new as well. A trace of grief, perhaps, or regret. Shadow pressed his muzzle into the outstretched hand, accepting the caress as his due. "He saved my life, Father," Ayanna said softly, joining them. "Twice today alone, and from what Dakota tells me, he's been protecting these mountains and the wolf packs for months." Judge Cooper nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright. He always was more than just a pet. His gaze lifted to Dakota. "Thank you for looking after him, for seeing him for what he truly is." The old man shrugged. "He looked after me as much as I looked after him. Some souls are too big to be contained by the roles we try to assign them." As night fell, they made preparations to descend the mountain at first light. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by fresh snow and fraught with new possibilities. Curtis and Redford, secured in the small side cave with Dakota standing guard, had lapsed into sullen silence, their reign of exploitation finally ended. Shadow found himself at the cave entrance, looking out across the moonlit valley toward the distant peaks where Akula's pack would hunt tonight. Maska sat beside him, his injured leg extended carefully, his lean body a reminder of all they had endured and overcome. Ayanna approached quietly, settling on the ground near them. For a long while she simply sat in companionable silence, respecting the bond that had formed between dog and wolf. When she finally spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "You belong to two worlds now, don't you?" she said, not really expecting an answer. Just like Dakota said, too wild for one, too civilized for the other. Shadow turned to look at her, seeing in her face the same dilemma. She, too, stood between worlds, the academic community of wildlife biology and the traditional knowledge of her mother's people, the human civilization that had raised her, and the wilderness that called to her spirit. "We'll figure it out," she promised, reaching out to touch both Shadow and Maska with gentle hands. "All of us together." In that moment, as moonlight silvered the snow and the distant howls of the pack echoed across the valley, Shadow felt the final pieces of his long journey fall into place. He had come full circle, from pampered pet to abused captive, to wilderness survivor to pack leader, only to discover that his true destiny lay not in choosing between these identities, but in embracing them all. Shadow's journey reminds us that it's never too late to discover new strength within ourselves. Like this loyal German shepherd torn from comfort, forced to endure cruelty, and ultimately finding purpose in the wilderness. Many of us have weathered unexpected storms in our later years. Perhaps you've lost a spouse, faced health challenges, or felt displaced in a rapidly changing world. Shadow's story speaks to that resilience born from adversity that resonates deeply with our generation. Remember how we were raised to believe in justice, in standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult? Shadow embodied these values, protecting the vulnerable and finding family among unlikely companions. His reunion with Judge Cooper mirrors our own deepest yearnings, to reconnect with what matters most, to know that our life's work has meaning. The most powerful moment isn't when Shadow confronts his abuser, but when he chooses mercy over revenge, wisdom over rage. This reflects our own journey of discovering that true strength lies not in clinging to bitterness, but in finding purpose that bridges our past and future. Shadow ultimately finds peace not by choosing between worlds, but by embracing both, just as we find fulfillment by honoring our history while embracing new beginnings. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.